And I'm just going to apologise in advance to everybody for my voice, which may be somewhat unreliable. And I'm also just going to let you know I'm speaking to notes because as one of those other late diagnosed ADHD people, I have no sense of time, no concept of time, so I need to inhibit my tendency to go off on tangents. So, all right, there we go. Kia ora tātou no inia hoki oku tūpuna I whānau mai I Ingarangi kei tamaki makaurau e hoe noho ana ko Emma Sadera toku ingoa no reira tēnā koutou katoa. So I'm Emma Sadera, I'm Associate Dean for Equity and Diversity and a Senior Teaching Fellow from the Faculty of Medical and Health Sciences at Waipapa Taumata Rau, the University of Auckland in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And I am delighted to be part of this symposium. Did that work? Yes, it did. Excellent. To talk a little bit about some of the questions and practices that I'm engaging with the aim of decolonising my academic work, teaching disability studies to medical students and undertaking research with disabled and other marginalised participants. So, in terms of my positionality, in speaking with you here today, you heard at the beginning I gave you my pepeha, and that's a little explanation of what a pepeha is in Māori culture. I should note that obviously I'm going to be speaking about Māori culture, my understanding of it, because Aotearoa, New Zealand is a bicultural nation, and so it's really important for me, for all of those of us who are living and working in these lands and in these spaces to have a good grasp of Te Ao Māori. So I gave to you my pepeha at the beginning, which explains that I am mixed race, I am from India and I'm from England, and Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland is now my home. And so, as I mentioned, I'm a disabled woman of colour living and working in the settler state known as New Zealand in the rest of the world, where I hold Tau Iwi status. Tau Iwi, that is non-Māori, non-Indigenous status, and I acknowledge my relationship as a treaty partner to tangata whenua, that is the people of that land. And as I say, I want to acknowledge up front that I am not an Indigenous person, I'm not Indigenous to Aotearoa, to the Pacific. I am therefore still learning and seeking to educate myself in what colonisation has meant and continues to mean for tangata whenua. And so what I'll discuss with you today in relationship to disability and indigeneity represents my current best understanding and is founded on my engagement with Indigenous scholars and their work. But any errors or misunderstandings are entirely mine to own and to correct. And I'm committed to doing that work to improve my knowledge and to thus be a better ally and activist. So in stating this positionality that I hold up front, I do note that it's not a neutral act. There are power dynamics at play in discussing positionality, identity and relationality, even for those of us within already marginalised groups such as disabled people, as identities are of course experienced intersectionally, and thus the risks to those with racialised and minoritised identities, including Indigenous and Global South people, are heightened. And I note this particularly as relationality praxis is, I contend, a vital part of challenging current hegemonic norms and establishing new, depathologized and decolonized sites of power in the academy and beyond. So throughout this, excuse me, keep going. Throughout this keynote talk, I will of course use the term disability and disabled, usually in an identity-first format, as that's what resonates for me, but I acknowledge others may have different preferences, and my language use is not intended to feel exclusionary. So my use of the term disabled is intended to encompass anyone who experiences impairment, chronic illness, neurodivergence, mental ill health, and who is disabled by those experiences. So if we look at who this then might include in the context of where I live and work now, According to the June 2022 report from Stats NZ, which is our national statistics agency, the rates of tangata whaikaha, which is people with disabilities, are slightly higher, as you can see, amongst Māori people and Pacifica people. So 24% of the overall New Zealand population identifies as disabled, so that's around 1.2 million people. But for the Indigenous population, that is actually slightly higher at 26%. However, when those numbers are adjusted for the population age structure, the prevalence of tangata whaikaha Māori is around 32%, so fairly significantly higher. And despite having these higher rates of health-related impairment, 39% of tangata whaikaha, that's Māori disabled people and Pacifica disabled people, report having an unmet health need, so that's 1.4 times higher than non-Māori. And 1 in 4 tangata whaikaha Māori report having insufficient income to meet their daily needs and experience inequities in accessing funding for equipment and care. So these numbers crudely, but I think effectively, demonstrate the effects of colonisation on Indigenous populations, for whom the already disadvantaging effects of experiencing disability that all disabled people experience are compounded by colonisation. So thinking about who this includes and who is disabled, I want to acknowledge that practices of colonisation do result, as I've mentioned, in increased levels of poor health and impairment for Indigenous peoples, leading often to increased experiences of disability in these populations, including in Aotearoa. And there's work done in Indigenous populations around the world, and this same finding comes up in Canada and in Mexico and in all sorts of places. However, studies have noted that many Indigenous communities may actually reject outright identification with the term and idea of disability, as this is not a conceptual definition that is meaningful for them, and instead feels like an external imposition, a recolonisation of sorts. And I've put some quotes here on the screen, which speak to this kind of recolonisation that can be perceived amongst Indigenous populations when contending with the label of disability. Excuse me, and of course I will share these slides afterwards, because I note that there are things that you may want to read and to think about in depth. And this sense of recolonisation can be exacerbated by interactions with medical professionals. And we've talked a little bit amongst ourselves already today about some of the issues with interacting with medical professionals who have perhaps limited understanding or knowledge of disability. And this is of course exacerbated by medical professionals who are non-Indigenous and who have often limited insight into A, the social and cultural experience of disability beyond impairment, and B, cultural competence around Indigenous constructions of impairment and disability. And I will note that these next two slides probably will just merely repeat things that you already know, but in reflecting on the theme of this symposium, we're invited to consider how the role that models play in academic and enacted constructions of disability, and to determine how and why we might move beyond them. So to that end, I just wanted to very briefly first note the main features of the dominant models, although as I said, I'm sure we're all painfully familiar with them already. So of course, the medical model of disability is the dominant model in medicine and healthcare, as it has been for a number of decades. And of course, it regards disability as an individual function and a function of impairment. And the goal of treatment is, of course, to fix or to cure disability, to bring disabled bodies as close as possible to the normate body, if we use Rosemary Garland-Thompson's framing. So by way of challenging the individualistic and curative aspects of the medical model, what became known as the social model of disability was developed. And of course, in this model, disability is not an attribute of an individual, but rather a complex collection of conditions, many of which are created by the social environment. Hence, the management of the problem requires social action and is the collective responsibility of society at large to make the environmental modifications necessary for the full participation of people with disabilities in all areas of social life. And this environment, of course, includes social, cultural, economic factors, as well as the built environment. However, of course, as you know, many disability scholars, including Shakespeare and Watson and various others since then, have argued, in practice, the distinction between impairment and disability can be unclear, especially as impairment can cause disability, and indeed disability can exacerbate an impairment. So disregarding or delegitimizing the notion of impairment can be problematic in itself. So models are, as I've just been discussing, by their very nature somewhat exclusive. If you invoke the medical model only, you disregard the socially, politically, economically, culturally constructed facets of what living life with impairment in disabling contexts constitutes. If you invoke only the social model, then you exclude folk for whom impairment is conceptually and actually dominant and for whom treatment is desired. So of course there have been many efforts to problematise this and develop models which sit more inclusively. For example, the biopsychosocial model developed by Engel in 1977, which attempted to integrate biological and social influences on disability together with psychological factors. Disability studies is, of course, now replete with multiple alternative models of disability. However, I want to note that still most of these models have been and are being developed in the global north. They therefore speak to an experience and an understanding of disability which is not in any way universal and which is therefore culturally unsafe and itself perpetuates inequity. There are also attempts by some Indigenous disability scholars to create frameworks that reflect their positionalities and understandings from a culturally safe perspective, such as Hickey and Wilson's 2017 Whānau Hawa alternative Indigenous approach, and I've alluded to that in the descriptor on the screen there. So, thinking about then, that's the sort of the place that we are with models, but if we think about moving beyond the models, some of the criticism that I've described around using models, models are and can be norming and reductive, and disability, we, us, our lives, our experiences, our relationships to objects, places, processes and structures are messy and complex and fluctuating and plastic. So some of the existing criticism of disability models emerging from disability scholars actually accord specifically with ways in which these models can be read as colonial products, which emphasise impairment and individuality and disregard or downplay perceptions of natural variation and holistic collectivist identities. Further, models of disability developed in the global north, as I've referenced, explicitly reflect Western notions, ideals and relationships to disability and impairment, which exclude or do not represent Indigenous experiences. These models position disability as largely individualistic and personal experiences, and this individualism sits at odds with many Indigenous ways of knowing and experiencing disability, which are holistic, collective and relational. In Māori cultural history, it's been argued that disability conceptually did not exist prior to colonisation. Those with what might be described by mainstream disability terminology as impairments were not othered or subject to deficit framing, but were regarded as simply part of the natural diversity of humanity and were positioned within their iwi or tribe and hapu or clan groups within the tribe, within the iwi, according to this understanding. So there is no specific word in Te Reo Māori, the Māori language, to describe disability, although, as I've used, the modern adopted phrase now is tangata whaikaha, which means people who are determined to do well. And we can think about what the meanings of that might be, Anna. So in addition to being unrepresented in most of the mainstream narratives of disability that emerge from the models which have dominated disability studies as a discipline, there is within them an inherent assumption of othering which many Māori disability scholars and tangata whaikaha reject. Instead, their cultural norms include and feature impairment as part of natural diversity, and often disability is accorded high status, including amongst many of the creation gods. And I've noted some on this slide here. So as you can see, Mahuika, the goddess of fire, was depicted as blind. Maui, the demigod of Polynesian stories, who features very heavily in Māori and Pacifica creation narratives, is depicted as having club feet. And Taiwhera Matea, the god of the winds, who is depicted in this image here, in this sculpture, was depicted as blind, portrayed as blind, and you can see that from this depiction here. So then, thinking about more inclusive representations, and if we think about these indigenous concepts of disability that I've been talking about, where impairment is perceived as different primarily in the context of natural diversity, an ontology of uniqueness rather than a framing as specifically as impairment. These Māori and Pacific conceptualizations of identity are multifaceted and multi-temporal, with connection to ancestors, to place, to space and to time as central, and not according to Western hermeneutic notions of linear time and constructions of identity formation. So is claiming disability as an identity thus excluding of Indigenous people who experience impairment as part of this natural diversity, but who therefore do not consider themselves as disabled? In discussing the work of Shakespeare and Watson around disability identity formation and the claiming, reclaiming of labels, Rivers Velarde notes that in this sense, it is easy to see that what has emerged as a political strategy for the liberation of disabled persons in the global north has arguably widened the divide between the north and the south, thereby reinforcing oppressive ideologies. So if then these dominant models of disability are open to criticism from a range of disability scholars and are also potentially actively recolonising disabled Indigenous people, what can I do as scholars of disability to decolonise our work at the same time as we seek to depathologise disability and centre anti-ableism? And here I think it's really important to explicitly note that just being anti-ableist doesn't absolve you from being complicit in other forms of discrimination. And so that's a constant place of work for us all, I think. So this is where I'm coming to it from. So one solution, one possible area, the site of action is in cripping our university, cripping our teaching, our learning and research spaces. So if we think about compulsory able-bodiedness as producing disability in the way that compulsory heteronormativity produces queerness, then the corollary is that compulsory settler values produces subalternity in Gramscian terms. So for Robert McCrua, the response to compulsory able-bodiedness is in using crip theory to provide materialist critique of these practices. In considering how I can strive to decolonise my teaching, my research, my activism within the academy, I see the value in cripping as offering an opportunity to create an anti-ableist and anti-colonialist paradigm. But this cripping has to be enacted in ways that are truly mindful of coloniser assumptions and which consciously seek to destabilise these. So for example, in my teaching, and as I mentioned, I teach stage 3 medical students, small subsections of them. I unfortunately don't get to teach all of New Zealand's medical students disability studies. Would that I were, and it's part of my end goal of global domination, believe me. But I teach disability studies and I teach about models of disability as part of that teaching. But I encourage my students to critique these as instruments emerging from global north positions and engaging with contested experiences of impairment and disability. I make space in the classroom for experts with lived experience of disability and indigeneity, and I welcome them to show up however they choose to and interact with students however is most meaningful for the shared collective korero, or conversation. In another example, I regard inflexible deadlines as inherently ableist and also founded on assumptions that every student enjoys privilege in their living circumstances and holds high academic cultural capital. These too are colonialist assumptions that do not consider, let alone prioritise, the lived experiences of many Māori and Pacific students who may well be living within multi-generational homes, have caring and working responsibilities, and need to prioritise these factors over their ability to meet a particular assessment deadline. My response to this is to crip my deadlines as much as I am able to. That is, to invite my students to meet the due dates as they can, according to the needs they have and the expectations they encounter, in conversation with me, in order that they're able to bring their authentic selves to the learning spaces. My teaching environment is one which I have a significant level of control over. The research space, however, is somewhat different, and we have again been talking together about the vagaries of ethics and all sorts of things today, and I think I'm just, leaning onto that as well. But how do we crip research spaces to decenter global north/western normative expectations and to reclaim space for crip concepts such as non-compliance and decomposition, when the expectations, as we have just recently heard, are inherently around orderliness and normative modes of expression, let alone research areas and methodologies that are familiar to reviewers? So here, enacting and engaging with Indigenous qualitative methodologies, including kaupapa Māori research and Talanoa, enacts decolonisation alongside anti-ableism, as these research approaches prioritise relationality and values such as whanaungatanga, which is kinship and connection, and manaakitanga, which is hospitality and generosity. However, as relational and interpersonal methodologies, they also allow space for flexibility and responsiveness to accessibility needs, including holding data collection activities at places of the participants' choosing, perhaps swim-along research, as Sadie was describing, and where they feel supported and comfortable, inviting whānau or extended family to attend and contribute or offer support, and being open to flexible durations akin to crip time. I am able to control that space and the ways in which I can conduct research to a certain extent. I am not, however, able to control the conditions under which I access funding for research, and I will not pretend that I have not encountered issues with funding bodies unfamiliar with Indigenous methodologies, or conversely, unprepared to accept their use in research teams who are not exclusively Indigenous. However, although of course the fundamental principle of nothing about us without us means that we must ensure that we do not remove opportunities from Indigenous and BIPOC researchers, those whose underrepresented voices and perspectives must be prioritised, the more of us who are able to reconsider the relatively small pool of Western-centric research approaches that are typically used and integrate, the more we're able to challenge these methodological hegemonies, and the more we're able to decolonise and depathologize our research approaches. But having comprehensively problematized disability models, where models can be useful is in helping those who have not yet begun to challenge received ideas about disability, let alone to engage critically with those meanings to approach this. So I want to talk a little bit about where I do see a value for models. So for example, again in my teaching, aside from the saturation of social and cultural messages and images around impairment and disability that my students, these medical students, have received in their lives, they've also internalised at least 3 years of medical training in which disability is, where it is even mentioned at all, positioned explicitly according to the medical model, explicitly and repeatedly, I should note. So it is disability, it is, we are something to be treated, fixed and cured. So for these students, this becomes axiomatic. The body is a series of systems and processes, and the optimal operation of these systems is, of course, the goal of medicine. Right? Right? So when they arrive in my classroom and I begin to tell them about how disabled is not a bad word, about how impairment and illness are part of the infinite variability of the human body-mind, how disability is political, how the normate body is geographically, temporally, culturally and historically contingent, and how treatment and cure are not the only lenses through which to view disability, they struggle to reframe their core fundamental beliefs. So being able to present them with models to unpack and compare and to help them critique those hermeneutic understandings to become reflexive and critical is a valuable tool in my teaching arsenal. Of course, as I mentioned, we problematize these models once they've been able to use them to shift how they think about disability initially, including acknowledging the explicit Western perspectives and their production in these contexts. And supporting this shift is important, particularly in future medical professionals, to encourage doctors to not just understand how prevailing medicalised ontologies of disability harm disabled people and the role of their profession in perpetuating that harm, but also to become active change makers in challenging that and serving their patients in more anti-ableist and culturally competent ways is essential. That is what real allyship and socially just allyship means. So to wrap up a little bit, I put here final thoughts, but I want to note that this is evolving thinking and working, and this is an ongoing process. And so these are not actually my final thoughts on the matter at all. But I want to offer these two kind of key points for us to think, to discuss, and to potentially to collaborate on. These two key practices that I'm currently wrestling with in engaging with teaching and research as a disabled Tawiwi academic working in colonised contexts and wishing to work against that are, firstly, positionality is foundational. If we do not reckon with ourselves and who we are as we come to these spaces, we risk reinforcing those colonialist mindsets, even as we strive against ableism. Being anti-ableist, as I mentioned, is not enough. Weaving together these decolonising and cripping practices as part of the same conscious effort in teaching, research, and indeed service is one way in which we may be able to challenge some of these uninclusive spaces, moving disability research and teaching towards more inclusive and socially just outcomes. And I want to close by posing a question for us to think about, discuss, and share our thoughts on, finding a response to. What can we do individually and collectively? How are we able to weave decolonisation and depathologization practices into our work on disability and in our enactment of our positionalities as disabled people, people with disabilities in the academy? Ngā mihi nui ki a koe. Thank you very much.